Namaste everyone. Welcome to today's guest talk with a very interesting title today, a lecture on the lecture. The speaker today is Dr. Ramesh Bijlani himself. We all know him very well by now. I'll give a formal introduction for him. Dr. Ramesh Bijlani is a prolific writer, an inspirational speaker, and a spiritual seeker residing at Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. A professor at AIIMS-New Delhi till 2005, Dr. Bijlani has been teaching for more than 50 years and has been admired for the simplicity and clarity of his talks. In this talk, he would touch upon a few secrets of a good lecture. Thank you, sir, for sharing your time with us. We look forward to an interesting session with you. Sir, you have to unmute yourself.
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Arunima, you call the title interesting, but it doesn't seem to interest most people. Uh, and it's understandable because not everyone actually has to give lectures. Not only that, lecture doesn't have a very good flavor. If somebody gets into a monologue, we say, stop lecturing to me. And in Hindi also, we say, lecture jhaad rahe ho. So it doesn't really have a very good flavor, and therefore there's a tendency that even when it is supposed to be a lecture, we try to use a different word. That's why we don't call these yes lectures, we call them yes talks. Talk looks less imposing than a lecture. And I coined one more term, structured interactive session, to indicate that it has a certain should have a certain structure, although an unstructured session also has a place in the teaching learning process, a free flowing discussion. But when we are talking about a talk or a lecture, it has to be relatively structured. And then it emphasizes the fact that even a lecture should not be a one way communication, it should not be a monologue, it should be interactive. And further, the abbreviation which you get from structured interactive section is SIS, SIS, SIS. And the love of a sister has such a sweet and soothing feeling. So that's why I particularly enjoy that term structured interactive session or a SIS. But call it by any name, call it a lecture or a SIS. A lecture is a lecture. And how it is delivered will depend upon the person who is delivering it. Very difficult for us to change our habits. I myself have quite often been accused of the lectures being not interactive enough. And I think that allegation multiplies when we are speaking online, because to have too much of interaction while the talk is going on is not very conducive, or not, doesn't go very well with an online presentation. But all the same, with all these limitations, we shall try and see today how a lecture can be made a little less intimidating, not as sort of not as conforming with the type of negative impression that goes with a lecture. So with that little introduction, let me go to the slides. The criticism of lectures is not new. And here is some criticism from an educationist, Fred Keller, who was by qualification a psychologist, a professor. and is best known for coming up with a system of teaching, which he called the personal system of instruction, which means that, as the name indicates, that teaching should be personalized. Each individual is different, and therefore we should keep in mind the unique characteristics of each student in our teaching process. And that is one of the basic principles also of integral education, that is to respect the individuality of each student. But then that obviously does not happen in a lecture, because we are speaking to a large number, exactly the same thing. uh, One can have a little provision for it by allowing scope for questions from different students with different interests and inclinations and abilities. But all the same, a lecture still remains by and large something which is standardized and caters generally to the average student in the class. And perhaps understanding his love for a personal system of instruction, we can understand why he said that the less professors lecture, the more students may learn. The criticism of lectures has increased after the substitutes became available. The first substitute was the availability of books. After the printing press was invented, uh, the lectures became less necessary than they were before. There was a time when much of knowledge was passed on from one generation to the other, primarily by the oral route, and that included lectures. But then once the books became available, then many people argued that why not just read a book instead of listening to a person. And then following that, more and more substitutes have been coming. And today we live in an era where there are so many sources of information on the internet, Google, YouTube, not to speak of the WhatsApp University. But the there's no limit to these resources available for learning, and therefore one may say that what is the use of having a lecture? Which means that for a lecture to be really useful, it should go beyond all these, and it should have some characteristics which are not satisfied by any of these substitutes. Lectures are criticized, of course, because substitutes are available, but then one has to find some more objective, clear cut reasons for the criticism. And some of the reasons that have been given are that in a lecture, the learning is passive, the student does not participate. It's essentially a one way communication, it's didactic teaching rather than participatory teaching, and does not allow the student the freedom to think freely and to question to the extent it should be. Second, further, the lectures level everybody in the class. The teacher cannot keep in mind the exceptionally bright and cannot keep in mind the weakest student either. And therefore, the lecture is meant primarily for the average student, and in that sense levels everybody. It has also been seen that very little of what is spoken in a lecture is actually retained by the students, and that, of course, makes taking of notes necessary and justifiable. But then, how little is retained and how more could be retained, we'll see a little later once more. And of course, a lecture which is not so good allows for little student participation, which means that if we can overcome some of these handicaps, then the lectures may not be criticized to that extent. But the fact is that lectures do continue, and it is not only to justify the existence of the teachers who lecture. Lectures do provide some knowledge in a crystallized form. And they're very efficient. May not be as efficient as YouTube, but all the same, lectures are efficient. And even for YouTube, whatever is, if a lecture is there on YouTube, at least once it has to be delivered by somebody. And it should have all the characteristics of a good lecture for it to be well received, even on YouTube. And they are flexible in the sense that the teacher can go back and forth wherever necessary, the way you can't in a book. So suppose the teacher is talking about the subject matter which forms, say, chapter 6 in a book. But then, if necessary, for giving a certain background, he has to go to something which is in chapter 2. He can do that. And if something will come much later, say in chapter 10, he can make a brief reference to that in such a way that it will still be understood, although the students are at chapter 6. Not only that, if he is teaching biology, but then there's a concept which actually involves understanding of physics or chemistry, he can digress to that concept in physics and chemistry, or chemistry in a way that it will fit in, the students will understand, and briefly in such a way to the extent that it is relevant to the present concept in biology. Not only that, he can in fact go to many other areas and make it truly interdisciplinary. Not only that, he can extend it beyond the curriculum and even beyond the subject. Because uh, this is an opportunity for the teacher to uh, create human beings or to facilitate the the students becoming well-rounded personalities, becoming better human beings, and therefore sometimes, although he's teaching a scientific subject, he may digress into English literature, sometimes into ethics and morality, sometimes into religion and spirituality, sometimes into philosophy. So all those digressions, which are deliberate, calculated, brief, and in such a way as not to interfere with the flow of the lecture, uh, are what makes a lecture unique, something which cannot happen in any other way of teaching, in the other tools of teaching, which are like say, the printed word or the internet. Further, the teacher can give the lecture a personal flavor. On the basis of personal experience, he can cite anecdotes, his personal experience, his personal opinions which one may be afraid to put into print, but at the same time, in a limited audience in front of the class, he can do that. And he can also give various different points of view, including his own, and then try to argue for and against each of those different points of view. He can cite anecdotes, he can crack jokes, uh, and give it a personal flavor. Uh, and these are some of the reasons why the lectures still continue in spite of all the criticism. Here is a brief statement by an educationist, a physiologist, Ian Roddy, why lectures continue. I do not know a better way to transmit a large amount of information so quickly and so efficiently to large numbers of people. Of course, now it has the reach of the lectures has multiplied in a way, one might say, through YouTube like platforms. Lecture delivered once can stay there for a much longer time and can be seen by much larger number of people. And also, as in case of a book, you can keep going back and forth. Of course, the teacher going back and forth is one thing, but going back and forth in a book is another. You didn't understand something, you want to read the same page once more, you go back. A paragraph you are over with, you go to the same paragraph again. Uh, One can do that also in a video. So, uh, in fact, if anything, the transmission of a large amount of information to large numbers has become more efficient with the current developments. Before going into how a good lecture should be, let's see what is not a lecture. A lecture is not merely the oral reproduction of printed matter from anywhere. It is not an oral reproduction of everything that the teacher knows. The teacher has to select what the teacher will share with the students in a lecture. And it's also not the oral reproduction of everything that is available on Google or YouTube. So for a lecture, uh, firstly, I mean, it should be a structured interactive section. Uh, it should be based on a critical synthesis, analysis, consolidation, and evaluation of ideas. Both synthesis and analysis are important. In fact, synthesis is more difficult than analysis. Analysis comes more easily to us than synthesis, but both are required depending on the context. Then summarizing or consolidation, important. And then evaluation, a critical evaluation of different points of view or of different uh, knowledge available. In science also, we have controversies. One set of experiments indicates one conclusion, another set indicates another conclusion, and then we try and find reasons for in favor or against one of those conclusions or the other. So that evaluation is required not only in philosophy but also in science. So the structured interactive session should be based on this critical synthesis, analysis, consolidation, and evaluation of ideas. It is not merely oral reproduction of what has been picked up from somewhere else. It's not a copy and paste job. Now, let's get to the nitty-gritty of how to give a good lecture. One could stop here. I could stop here and just say by not doing it the way I do. Uh, because those who can do it, do it. As George Bernard Shaw says, those who can do, do. Those who can't, they teach. So it's only someone who can't deliver a good lecture starts teaching others how to give a good lecture. But let's see a little more. To give a good lecture, one should prepare. That's, of course, goes without saying. But then the preparation should start well in advance. And why that is necessary is because one can't give a lecture on the basis of what one read today morning. One can't give that lecture in the evening, the same day. Mm. Because, in fact, it's a disaster. Sometimes teachers try to do that. They know a lot, but then they come across something new, something fresh, which they've just read on the day they have to speak, and then they try to incorporate that into the talk. That generally turns out to be a disaster because knowledge also requires a certain amount of internalization, a certain degree of maturation uh, before it can be put across to others. Uh, Professor Oliver Wendell Holmes, a medical person, a physician in the Boston area in the 19th century, uh, as he said, knowledge and timber shouldn't be much used till they are seasoned. So that's one reason why the preparation should start well in advance. But there are other reasons, as we shall go along, why the preparation should start well in advance is because if preparation consists of just reading, that reading should start well in advance so that after that there is time for the other processes which have to follow that reading. Not only maturation of that knowledge, but also all the processes that it has to go through. When you can understand that in light of what we already talked, that it has to be there has to be a process of analysis, synthesis, consolidation, evaluation, and so on. That needs time, and there are other things also which take a lot of time, and therefore the preparation, the first step in which would be generally reading, that should start well before the lecture. So it's the preparation starts with reading, and one should read as much as the teacher can and select as little as possible. Now, why read as much as a person can if one has to actually speak very little? Reading more than what one actually will speak, firstly, helps build up the confidence to speak. Secondly, it also helps while answering the questions from students. So read as much as you can and select as little as you can because there's a limit to what can be put across in a single talk, and there's also a limit to what the students can absorb in a limited time. Should the teacher carry notes? Uh, to go completely without anything and just speak can turn out to be a disaster. And therefore, something in writing is important. But then the notes should not be so extensive that one is essentially reading out from those notes. So a compromise is what maybe we may call an outline, which has the major points that the teacher will touch. This gives a certain structure, a certain sequence, and also limits the digressions, which might otherwise be too many. So an outline. But then these days, in a way, the PowerPoint slides have become a substitute for the outline because what there could be an outline on paper is now very often a number of slides. And that, in fact, is one of the legitimate uses of slides. The slides should not, again, have a full text reading out everything that should be there. But then what a good slide is like, that will be another session maybe later on. Today, we are not talking about the quality of slides, but the important thing is that one should have an outline, and the outline can be in the form of slides, but still it may be worthwhile having also a piece of paper just in case of a technical failure. If the person can't project the slides, at least that outline on paper would help. Then one should rehearse what one would speak, especially applies to young teachers who are just beginning to teach. They should rehearse, and they should specially rehearse if they want to crack a joke. On this, there is a little joke that I'll tell you. Once there was a young priest who went to the church and heard a sermon. In the sermon, the priest who was speaking said, "The best years of my life were spent in the arms of another man's wife. The woman was my mother." So this young priest liked this very much. He said, now when I speak in my sermon also, I'll use the same joke. But he didn't rehearse. And he started saying in his sermon, the best years of my life were spent in the arms of another man's wife. The woman was, the woman was, the woman was, the woman, I can't remember who the woman was. Now, you can understand what happened. So, uh, that's the disaster that a joke which has not been rehearsed can lead to. So, after the person has read much more than was necessary, some of the essential steps in preparing the outline would be selection of what will actually be spoken, the sequence in which it will be presented, and the style in which it will be presented. And advanced preparation improves the style, because what happens is that after the selection and sequence have been established, the person, in his mind, the ideas keep rolling again and again. And every time they roll again and again subconsciously, and it could happen anytime, anywhere. He is not specially preparing for the lecture. He may be having a bath and still the ideas may be rolling. He may be going somewhere, sitting in a bus or a train, and still the ideas are rolling in his mind. And every time they roll, he finds that he comes up with a better way of, a better style for saying the same thing. Better words, fewer words, more effective words. That is essentially what the style is about. The processes involved in all this are essentially summarizing, simplification of the subject. Complex ideas can be simplified to a great extent if one works hard on them, and synthesis, which is more difficult than analysis. Now, here is something from an experienced teacher, James Calnan. Although 70% of the allotted time will be given to the topic, 70% of the effort in preparation will have to be devoted to the art of putting it across, to make it interesting, informative, understandable, and enjoyable. And the art of putting it across will keep improving in your own mind at a subconscious level if the preparation has begun well in advance. Now let's come to the content. What should the talk have? It should be tailor-made to the audience, but then which section of the audience? Generally, the average student. Or if it's a mixed crowd, then again one has to select which is the section of the audience that you would particularly like to address. Then the content, what sort of content should it be? Should it be examination oriented, which even average students may like? That is one thing which good teaching really does not consist of. The teaching should not be examination oriented. Instead, the exams should be learning oriented. If a student is interested only in examination oriented learning, then there are textbooks available which have that approach. Not all textbooks also are examination oriented. Some of the textbooks also encourage in-depth learning and encourage the student to think and question that can be built even into a textbook. Making the subject interesting and even entertaining can also be built into a textbook. But some textbooks are essentially examination oriented, but that is not how a good lecture should be. But instead, an examination can be learning oriented, which means set up in such a way that while answering, the student is compelled to think, and in the process ends up learning something new. When one starts speaking, say when it comes to the delivery, uh, after the preparation and content and everything has been decided upon, one of the things many people fear is stage fright. And if you have stage fright, don't worry, you have company. There's hardly any speaker who does not feel a little nervous, at least for the first few seconds after he has gone to the podium. And that is probably one of the uses of the podium, because the legs are hiding. And so if the legs are trembling because of stage fright, the audience can't see it. So you have company. But at the same time, most people are able to overcome this stage fright within the first few seconds, and then they warm up and they realize that they know enough to be able to speak with confidence. And in general, with very few exceptions, the speaker who is well prepared will know much more than the audience, and therefore he really need not feel nervous. Now, one of the most important things in the delivery of the talk is to keep the time limit in mind. And one should take less than the allotted time. There's never any penalty for not using up all the time. And one should also keep in mind the attention span of the students. And it has been seen that the attention span of the audience is generally about 20 minutes. Not much of what is spoken after the first 20 minutes is retained. Here is a curve that shows that if we ask people less than a week after the lecture, you find that around 80% of what was spoken in the first 20 minutes is retained. After that, there's a steep fall, and very little, hardly 25% is retained of what was spoken after the 20th minute. And when it comes to the 40th or the 60th minute, then perhaps by the end of the talk, hardly 10% is retained. But that is soon after the lecture or within 1 week of the lecture. But if we ask the person more than 1 week after the lecture, then you find that even of what was spoken in the first 20 minutes, only about half is retained. However, there are some saving features. The curve is not exactly like this, but a little more like this, which means that even after what was spoken, even what was spoken after the first 20 minutes, some of it is retained. And even within the first 20 minutes, some of what was spoken is retained much better to the level of 100%. Now, what do these spikes correspond to? These spikes correspond to the points at which somebody in the audience asked a question, or the teacher asked a question, or the teacher cracked a joke, or the teacher narrated a personal anecdote. Now, these are the points at which we get these spikes, which means that these things are remembered even if they are spoken quite late into the lecture. So, how can one increase the amount of retention from a lecture? By increasing the number of these spikes, which means that one should, for at least that reason, encourage more of participation by the audience, and also keep introducing into the session at different points something personal, some jokes, some anecdotes, some stories, analogies, and so on. Now, in a talk, one can understand that the structure would be basically an introduction, then the main body of the talk, and then in conclusion, or what one might call the beginning, the middle, and the end. And it has been said that the talk should have a good beginning, a good ending, and the two should be kept as close to each other as possible. Uh, One may use an outline, which can be called notes, but this should not carry a text from which the person is reading out. Then sometimes, a summary periodically while the talk is going on is also necessary to put in brief what has already been talked. So a recapitulation of what has already been taught briefly is also required. The transition from one type of ideas to another should be smooth but clear. So the shifting of gears, should not be, it should neither be unnoticed nor it should be jerky. Then one should speak slowly, loudly, clearly, and in a sweet voice. It should not be a continuous thing. One should pause and pause when necessary. Why in quotes? When necessary, sometimes to allow time for reflection, sometimes to allow time for uh, the students to ask a question. Sometimes, when a question has been asked, to give the time to the students to think about the answer to the question. But why in quotes? In quotes, because sometimes one may pause even when it is not necessary for any of these reasons. The teacher may just stop and pretend as if he has lost thread of the idea and says, "Oh, where was I?" Now, the teacher is perhaps pretending, but then that is how he wakes up the students. And if even one of the students tells, "Sir, this is where you were," the student enjoys it. The, st- the rest of the class also enjoys, or the teacher also sometimes loses thread and then he forgets where he was. So that's why in quotes. Then the language should be simple, informal, and conversational, but precise. There's a difference between language which is written and the language which is spoken. So a lecture is a spoken mode of communication. So therefore, the language should be conversational in style. But that doesn't mean it should not be precise. And of course, the student participation is important. They should be encouraged to ask questions. And then how the questions are handled is also important. Uh, Firstly, the question is not an invitation for a big digression. A question is not an invitation for another lecture. A question should be answered clearly, briefly, and politely. Because even if the answer is not called for immediately and the answer will come maybe later on after a few classes later or something, then still it has to be handled in such a way that, well, it will come in detail later, but briefly, this is what the answer right now. And if you don't understand it fully, doesn't matter, you'll understand it better. And remind me the next time when we are on this topic, whether your question has been answered. So one should be polite about it. And suppose the teacher doesn't know the answer, then one should not get angry. One should not humiliate the student. That goes without saying. And instead, there's no harm in confessing that I do not know. I'll look up. A question which the teacher cannot answer is also an opportunity to inculcate in the habits in the students one more important habit. Between the question and the answer, one should always interpose one more step, and that is thinking. So the teacher, even if he does not know the answer, he can say that I don't know, but then at the same time, if it is possible to think and come up with a reasonable answer, which may be a reasonable guess, you might say, then the teacher can indulge in that type of an exercise, because that is what tells the students that everything doesn't have to be known in advance. Quite a bit of knowledge can be gained just by clear thinking and reasoning. And therefore, the student also learns that, well, one can arrive at answers also by thinking. One doesn't have to know everything in advance. And the teacher, a student also learns that even the teacher doesn't know everything, and he's willing to admit it. And maybe next time he'll give a more knowledgeable answer based on what he has actually discovered in the literature. But right now, at least he has given us a tentative answer, which seems to be reasonable, because there are two types of wrong answers. It may be wrong, but at least it's reasonable. So, an answer which one arrives at through purely by thinking about the question may be right and reasonable, or it may be reasonable but wrong, but at least it is not wrong and ridiculous. These are things which the student can pick up from the teachers, and this is an opportunity to inculcate that type of understanding also among the students. So, the student participation is, or audience participation is sometimes traditionally not allowed in a sermon, in a place of worship. So a good lecture should not be like a sermon where questions are not the norm. Instead, it's better that a sermon should be like a good lecture. Even in a sermon, one can encourage questions. The delivery should be such that it stimulates interest in the subject, and the sincerity and enthusiasm of the teacher should come through. Of course, there should be some humor that helps in not only creating a light-hearted atmosphere, a more congenial atmosphere, it also improves retention, because we saw that some of the points at which the material is retained, even if it was spoken more than 40 minutes after the talk began, it is those points where a joke was cracked. Then eye contact with the audience, which again is not possible in the Zoom sessions. If I'm showing the slides, there can be no eye contact. So if the videos are off, again, there can be no eye contact. But in a physical uh, talk, one can show the slides and still have eye contact. And for that, it's important that the hall should not be dark. Just because slides are being shown, it does not mean that the lights have to be switched off. Uh, in fact, good slides are those which can be seen even when the lights are on. And slides are one of those teaching aids. The blackboard is almost obsolete, but whiteboards are still being used. Green boards are also used, and one of the best combinations is a green board with a yellow chalk. Uh, but anyway, that will be again digressing too much, deviating from today's topic. So teaching aids are okay, but then they should be used only as aids. They are not a substitute for knowing the subject. They are not a substitute for a good preparation for the talk. And then one should also try and get a feedback from the students. It may not be possible after every lecture, but generally it is possible after a set of lectures. Uh, Now, how not to do it? We'll have some of these things, how to do it, how not to do it, a checklist for good talks, and so on. And some of it may be repetitive, but then giving it in different forms perhaps reinforces it a bit. And so we'll go over this a little faster because now quite a bit of it will be repetition under a different heading in a different form. So, how not to give a lecture? One should not dictate notes to the students. That would be just examination oriented teaching and nothing more than that. One should not read from a book or notes. Uh, the student might as well read the book himself. One should not read from a slide. A slide should not have everything that has to be spoken. It should just have a few points to keep the person on track, to provide an outline. And one should not start a talk with a slide, which means that as soon as the person is given an opportunity to speak, he shouldn't say, slides on, lights off. That's not how a talk should begin. There should be a few words spoken before the first slide is shown. One should not call the material that is being presented difficult. Then the students are likely to find it difficult. Even if it's a topic which is generally considered difficult, the teacher should say, well, people think it is difficult, but that's a misunderstanding. It's not really as difficult. I'll make it simple. So don't call the material difficult. One should not digress unintentionally. Intentional digressions with a purpose are okay, but then the teacher is conscious of it and comes back again to the point so that he picks up the thread in such a way that the digression does not make a difference. So he says, I'm going to digress. When the digression is over, he says, this is where we digressed. He may not use these words, but now we connect with where we left. He may not use these words, but that is essentially what he's doing consciously. Then one should not use jargon, technical terms which are avoidable. How does this sound? It is commonly believed that the sweet pomaceous fruit of the tree Malus pumila, commonly but erroneously called Malus domestica, if consumed regularly on a daily basis, ensures that you will no longer be dependent on the leaders of the healthcare system for your well-being. I'm sure many of you have guessed what it actually is trying to say. All what it's trying to say is an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So why not say that instead of getting into all this jargon, calling the apple a pomaceous fruit of such and such a botanical name, and then instead of saying uh, an apple a day, instead of a day is consumed regularly on a daily basis, instead of saying keeping the doctor away, you will no longer be dependent on the leaders of the healthcare system for your well-being. Now comes to the same thing. Why not just say an apple a day keeps the doctor away? Now, how not to do it? If one is using a whiteboard or a blackboard or a green board, do not face the board. Do not hide behind the lectern, especially if the speaker is not very tall. And do not leave the lecture incomplete. One should know right from the beginning that this is the time available. So how I will finish it within the time available. And certainly one should teach to impart, not to impress. And using jargon, getting into details which are irrelevant, uh, giving a talk in which you are including all the research that you have done, although it has no place in that talk. All that is only to impress, but that doesn't add to the value of the talk. It only makes it less useful for the listeners. So teach to impart, not to impress. Now here's a checklist for lectures. The volume should be such that the talk is heard also at the back of the hall or the auditorium. It should be a lively talk free from monotony. And if the slides are being shown, they should be seen also by those sitting at the back of the hall. And the teacher should not indulge in any distracting mannerisms. Using hands, gestures, facial expressions to convey is okay, because non-verbal communication is extremely important, and a lot of this communication is in fact non-verbal in nature. But then distracting mannerisms like pacing up and down the hall and so on, those are not really proper. The talk should be lucid, clearly structured, delivered at a pace that allows the students to take notes, and the student participation should be adequate. The teaching aids like slides, etc., should be used properly. The teacher should not be in a hurry and yet finish on time. The human contact with students is important, and sometimes that might have to be individualized, taking interest in the students, not just as students, but as human beings. And the interest should be maintained throughout the session. The atmosphere should be that of created should be that of enthusiasm and lightheartedness, and the teacher's enthusiasm and sincerity is what contributes the most to it. And one should try to address all types of students, which means that it may be addressed primarily to the average, but then a little bit for the brighter students, or at least encouraging the bright students to ask questions and answering those questions at their level. And also simplifying the subject to an extent that even the not so bright students, below average students, can understand. So that can be kept in mind, although the average level of the talk may be for the average student. Here is again something along these lines from Cicero, who was one of the greatest figures of the Roman period. He was both a scholar, an educationist, and a political leader. Not only there's an art in knowing a thing, but also a certain art in teaching it. Closing thoughts. When you're about to close, you should say that you're about to close, because that is once again when you will have good attention from the audience. So here are some of the closing thoughts. First, say what you will say, then say it, and in the end, say what you have said. So saying what you will say is the introduction, saying it is the body of the talk, and in the end, say what you have said, that is the closing. Before you start speaking, check that the slides are okay, the microphone is working, the lights are working. If you have to operate the lights, learn the controls of the lights, the switches, and the other signals. And if a pointer has to be used, before the talk begins, learn how to use that particular pointer. And finally, do not forget to pray when you start and when you end. Pray for what? Not praying for impressing the audience, but pray that here's an opportunity for you to give what you have to an audience who possibly needs it. So let me be a good, sincere, faithful servitor of the divine, and do this job for which I have been chosen as the instrument to the best of my ability. And also for the receptivity of the audience, let them be in a receptive mood so that they can get the maximum from the talk. That is the sort of prayer. And if one starts with a prayer, one finds that the words come naturally. You can be more spontaneous. You don't have to depend exactly on which words you will use. The words will come on their own as if they are coming from a higher source. A few common questions related to a lecture. Should a lecture be based on a set of specific learning objectives? Now, opinions differ a lot. Specific learning objectives, are what detailed objectives of what actually the student will learn, say from a talk or from a course. And they go something like this. At the end of the talk, the student or the lecture, the student should be able to. And then you list 5, 8, 10, 15, whatever points. Now, I personally find these very uneducational because they're very restrictive. They impose a sort of a limit on what has to be learned and also make it very essential that all that must be learned, although all that may not be necessary. And it may also add an expectation that unless a student knows all that, the student can't pass an exam. But the fact remains, even places where these objectives are prepared, the students do not realize all the objectives, and yet they pass in the exams. So, what purpose are they really serving? Why not to be a little more spontaneous and just keep in mind, broadly speaking, what the subject is, and inculcate in the student the uh, habit of thinking. Let him learn how to learn rather than learn, and leave a lot to the student to learn on his own. For that, it's important that we uh, try to aim at a self-directed learner who wants to know, who wants to learn, who is curious to learn more. That is much more important, and all these things do not go well with a talk which is based on specific learning objectives. The teacher is all time thinking first objective covered, second objective covered. I've seen teachers doing that. 10th objective covered. So talk becomes so monotonous, so serious, so dead serious that it becomes a useless talk. You covered all the objectives, but you've done actually worse than what can happen in a textbook. So objectives are highly tangible. And that sort of an approach is rather uneducational. What matters more is what is intangible in the teaching learning process. Should lectures be evaluated by students? Again, opinions differ, but the points why students should be encouraged to evaluate the teaching, whatever it's lectures or any type of teaching is, because they can be critical. They are the ones who have to receive it. We may not have judged what is important for them or how they will understand. And they are the ultimate judge of how useful it was, how much they gained from it. But then the reasons why I sometimes thought that it should not be encouraged is because one does not know what the student is actually evaluating. The student may be evaluating how much the teacher knows, which means a very scholarly teacher may be evaluated well even if he delivered a bad lecture. Secondly, the student may be evaluating whether the talk was examination oriented. Now, that is not always the best lecture. Or the student may be evaluating uh, the personality of the teacher. There's something called the Fox effect. An actor who knew nothing about the subject was told to give a lecture, and the students evaluated him very highly because he could dramatize the whole thing. So that capacity to dramatize is what may be evaluated. So one doesn't know what the student is evaluating. And finally, the students may be evaluating not the lecture, but the person who delivered the lecture. If he's a good person, they think that he's a nice person, friendly, compassionate, loving, considerate. If he has those qualities, he may be evaluated well, irrespective of how his lecture was. So therefore, evaluation by the students can be tricky. Another reason why I sometimes said that it doesn't serve much purpose is, or maybe some people are against it, is because it may be misused by the higher authorities. If a teacher does not get good evaluation by the students, the teacher may not be promoted, and sometimes he may even be sacked. He may lose his job. So these are some of the reasons why I said that students should not be allowed to evaluate teaching. So there are pros and cons, but on the whole, yes, students should have an opportunity to evaluate teaching because that is how teachers can actually improve. You get a better idea of the merits of the dinner from the dinner guests than you do from the cook. So you get a better idea of the quality of teaching from the students than from the teacher. Do audiovisual aids have a place in teaching? Yes, they have a place as aids, but there's no place for misusing them, which means that one should not use them as a substitute for knowing the subject. One should not use them for reading out what has to be spoken. So it has to be used only as an aid. And they are important because there are both types of learners. Some are auditory learners, some are visual learners. So some students may be able to understand everything even if it is just spoken, but some learn much more if there's also a visual aid. And these days, of course, we can have easily aids which are both audio and visual in the form of videos. So yes, use of audiovisual aids has a place in teaching, but not their misuse. Should the students be given learning material related to the lecture? Now that would be spoon feeding if you give too much of it. Earlier it was handouts. Now a lot of that material is posted by the teacher on the net, but spoon feeding should be avoided. And as far as possible, the students should be encouraged to learn on their own from books, even if it's from the internet. Let them search a little, work a little hard, and go through a process similar to what the teacher went through, the process of synthesis, analysis, selection, and so on. But all the same, in moderation, up to a point, maybe there can be no hard and fast rule about giving or not giving the material. So, moderation, as in everything in life, is important. How did Sri Aurobindo speak? Here is an account by one of his students at Baroda when he was teaching English and French at Baroda. Here is something which one of his students, Rajaram Patkar, has written. Hardly any gesture or movement of limbs, he stood like a, without any gesture or movement of limbs, he stood like a statue, motionless, and the language used to flow from his lips with natural ease and melody that kept his audience spellbound. Every sentence that he uttered was full of meaning and set the audience thinking for days together. So, when the quality is good, many of the things that I was talking about, like using body language, this and that, they become irrelevant. Here was a person who was standing like a statue, yet the ideas flowed naturally in a sort of a melody. And what he said was not only full of meaning, it also set the audience thinking for days together. It left a lot of room for reflection. And here is something about how he spoke from a scholar, Jyotish Chandra Ghosh. When he spoke in public, he would resign himself to a power with a capital P, in the higher power, and not even think what he was going to say and would stand fixed like a statue. Again, that same thing, standing like a statue. He repeated automatically what he heard uttered by some invisible power in his ears. This applies particularly when one is talking about spiritual truths. One just has to act as an unobstructed channel for the flow of words from a higher power. That's exactly how mantras have been created. This is a picture of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the meditation hall and the shrine, the place from where I'm speaking, the place where I stay and work, and a place to which you are all welcome. For any questions or comments, please feel free to drop an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible, and thank you all for being there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge from the vast experience you have as an inspirational speaker and a teacher, of course. Participants, if anyone of you have a question, please, you can unmute yourself and speak, and you can put the question in the chat box. Please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, yes, you are.
Yeah. Very good evening, sir.
Good evening, Lena.
Yeah. So there is one subject which I teach which is very difficult. It's international study, and for that I have to study from books written by international authors only. So comprehending it and making it simple. But when I teach, I sometimes feel that when it's Indian laws, it is easy for me. But when it is international, I have to put lot of effort. But still I feel that much more has to be done.
Subjects which are fact oriented rather than idea oriented will take a lot of hard work on the part of the teacher. Um, but then again, it can be made interesting if you uh, don't just stick to the facts, but also try and relate them. Uh, for example, if one is say talking, I have a little more experience in teaching, say, history of medicine. You can talk about history of medicine as in a sort of chronological set of events happening one after another. That is one way to teach history. But then there is a more interesting way of teaching history, and that is look at it in terms of why certain things happened at a particular period in history. For example, hardly anything happened in the Western world for about 1500 years. After the fall of the Roman Empire till the Renaissance was a period of about 1500 years, hardly anything happened. Why is it? Was there no intelligent person born during that period? So, you are also trying to talk about something which may not be strictly historical in nature. Then, all the mistakes that the people made. They worked hard, their observations were right, but the conclusions were not right. And the conclusions got corrected after more research after another 25 or 30 years. So, you're talking about all those things also. This person discovered this, and this person discovered this, person made a mistake. So, this was corrected by this person 25 years later. But why did that mistake occur? That mistake occurred in the first place because observations are always right, conclusions are not always right. You can always draw more than one set of conclusions from the same data using logic. They're all logical, but one set is correct, the other set is wrong. Now, something similar, I'm sure, can happen also in international relations. Why is it that nations or leaders behave in a particular way? What is it that determines the improvement in relations, the worsening of relations, as has been happening? And some of the books by Sri Aurobindo could help in understanding how one can have a wider view to such subjects also. And the most relevant books are The Human Cycle and The Ideal of Human Unity. These are two works which can be considered partly history, partly sociology, partly psychology, partly politics. And of course, everything is permeated by spirituality when Sri Aurobindo writes. So it has all these subjects and spirituality permeating all of them. And you can see what a global and comprehensive picture he presents: the human cycle and the ideal of human unity. Which means that
Human cycle and
one has to study and then reflect a lot. The teacher has to reflect and
Hmm. Thank you so much, sir.
So we have a message in the chat box from Marcelo. Thank you for the wonderful session. All the principles you mentioned, Dr. Ramesh, apply regardless of the theme of the lecture, or something else should be taken into account when the lecture is about spirituality or a more technical matter. So please unmute yourself.
these are only general principles. There would have to be a change in the details depending upon the subject, depending on the audience. There would be just as we saw that if it is international relations, then certain things become difficult, or some other things become necessary. If it is spirituality, as we saw in case of Sri Aurobindo, you need not prepare anything. You're talking based on your own personal spiritual experience, and at that time you're just letting the words flow from a higher power. So then you don't have to prepare anything. But a person who is teaching something more concrete, like say international relations or history or science, has to study those facts. And then, of course, to that may be added other dimensions which come from a higher source.
Thank you, sir. Participants, if anyone else has a question, please go ahead. Sir, I don't see anyone coming up with any question. Thank you again, sir. I thank the participants as well for being there with us. We can close today's session with a moment of peaceful silence. Namaste.